Okay, so welcome. My name is Josh. I'm a GP at Jackson Square Ventures. We're an early stage venture firm here in San Francisco. On our second fund, they reached about 120 million. And this is a little bit about my background. So I've been involved in marketplaces for the last about 14 years. First as the founding team at Odesk, which is now Upwork with Gary over there, and founding team at Rev. And then a few of the marketplace investments that we've done. And you'll see there's a big range from consumer marketplaces like OfferUp to things like Alto, which is a pharmacy, some things in real estate like Crexi and Rented, and some B2B marketplaces as well like Contently. So a pretty broad experience across a wide variety of marketplaces. And what I'm going to talk about today is really just my observations and frameworks for thinking about how to make great marketplaces and how to design marketplaces that I've observed over the last 13 years. And it's actually just a lazy way to make a presentation because I just put all my blog posts in a PowerPoint. So that's what you got. So first thing is kind of, this is my perfect marketplace. If you could go through and check every one of these boxes about yours, please let me know. This to me is sort of the perfect thing. And I think the first one is, in my opinion, by far the most important. If you can build a marketplace that provides massive productivity gains in the world, right? Take massive inefficiencies out of the equation, then you've built something amazing. And that's the history of the world, is moving towards greater and greater productivity because it lowers costs for buyers, so it makes it easier to acquire buyers, and you can have suppliers earn more money. So both sides of the marketplace will flock to your platform. The next thing is I particularly like massive existing markets, especially when they're inefficient. I don't particularly like trying to launch a new industry or a new market. It's still amazing to me. Almost every day I see a $50 billion industry that's run incredibly inefficiently with pen and paper and people calling around, and these are all great opportunities for marketplace platforms. And then the rest, I think a lot of you have probably seen various different approaches at the checklist from different VCs. So I'll kind of go through some of these quickly. High fragmentation is great, makes it much easier to keep everybody on the platform. Being in the payment flow is critical, both for your rake and your revenue, obviously, but also just for closing the loop on quality and really understanding the good transactions versus the bad transactions. Frequency of usage, I'm going to get into a little bit more later, but this next one is a little unique. I think of it as the irregular, non-monogamous usage. And what I mean by that is, if you have a marketplace that's, well, let's take home cleaners or maids. Most people use a maid, once every few weeks. It's the same person every single time. It's the same day and time every single 2 weeks. And that's actually really hard for a marketplace to monetize because the need just isn't there to have, because the marketplace's core value is matching. And when you have peak demand, it may be on a Saturday, a Monday, you don't know who you're going to get, you don't care if it's the same person. That's a much, much better dynamic for the marketplace because you're adding value every time you make one of those matches. In that situation where you're using the same person every single time on a regular schedule, there's just not that much value there. So it's much, much harder. I like standardization possibilities. This makes it easier to really understand and control the quality of the transaction. If everything is custom, it's really hard to ever improve quality. I think you've heard a little bit about network effects. I'm going to talk a little bit more about how I view those later. Market expansion, I think, is huge, especially what everyone has found. Every time you can lower the customer effort by a factor of 10, demand explodes, right? I use Uber way more than I ever took taxis, and it's because it just got so much easier. The same thing is happening with OfferUp. OfferUp is a Craigslist competitor, if you don't know it. It's the country's largest mobile marketplace. And people buy and sell on OfferUp way more than they ever did with Craigslist because it's just so much easier. You take out your phone, take a picture, and you've sold an item. And no disintermediation. I have a slide on disintermediation later. So, okay, now we get into my frameworks. So the first one is horizontal versus vertical. This is a common question a lot of people ask about marketplaces. For a while, I think everybody thought, oh, you should just build vertical marketplaces. That's the future. Well, I think that's a fundamentally flawed assumption because to me, two of the things that matter most are just your frequency of purchase and the size of the transaction. And the observation is that when you have incredibly high frequency but low transaction size, that's things way out on the right, and that tends to be things like taxis and meals and food, right? And those are great, and those have to be incredibly seamless, really quick to transact, and super simple. And then you have things way in the upper left, and that's things like Zillow for homes, right? Not many people buy homes every day. But the type of marketplace you would build is completely different, right? No one wants an Uber for buying a home, where you press a button and you just spent $1 million. Nobody wants that. So you have to build something that's much more about variety and letting the buyer search and browse and pick, whereas on the other axis, you need to build things very differently just for speed of transaction. And then here's where I think it gets interesting. So, you know, when Uber first came out, everybody started copying them, right? There was the Uber for plumbers, the Uber for locksmiths, the Uber for everything. And I think that was a huge mistake, because those things I put all in these categories of relatively low frequency and relatively low price. And those services or goods, I believe, need to be grouped in a horizontal platform. And part of it is just because nobody wants 100 different apps on their phone for everything they might use once every couple of years. That's a terrible experience. So you'd much rather have a horizontal platform that you can go to for everything, and that's what drives, once you group all those things together, that drives the frequency up, because across all those categories, you might use it very often. You know, obviously, at a place like Upwork, there's freelance services for literally everything that can be done remotely. That's part of what makes the platform work so well. And then the top right section, you'll notice, is relatively empty. I think this is actually a huge opportunity. I think of these as, I call them internet procurement platforms or industry procurement platforms. There's a whole wave of B2B marketplaces coming where businesses spend a lot of money very frequently on a whole variety of things. So there's RigUp, which rolls up all the vendors in the oil and gas industry, and then there's things like Scientist and Science Exchange that do the same thing in pharma. So I think that's going to be a continued emerging category of these B2B platforms. Okay, next one is on match types. So I touched on a few of these. I think of it as there's three basic categories. You can have the double commit. You post a job, someone applies, and then I accept that person. So both sides have to commit to the transaction. And then that's basically the slowest and least efficient, but it is sometimes necessary, especially if you don't have standardization. If you do have standardization, you can get away with one of these single commit type platforms where either the buyer picks, and it's a single click, the buyer can commit to a transaction, or the supplier picks, which is more like Uber, right? A request comes in, any supplier can basically claim the job. So the supplier picks, if you can get to that model, is by far one of the most efficient ways, because a key metric for every marketplace is basically fill ratio, right? What's the percentage of transactions that happen over the total requested or posted? In a supplier picks model, you can actually get close to 100%. In one of these double commit models, you're usually around 20, 30, 40%, or 50% if you're incredibly good. So if you can move down this chain in terms of the match type, you'll get a much, much higher fill ratio. Okay, this is sort of a mistake I've made in the past. I just call it the desperation curve. When you're designing your marketplace, I've made mistakes on the front end of, hey, we're going to require these big profiles and tests and screens and all these wonderful things, and that's going to make quality great. Well, what I didn't realize is that for high quality providers, they're not going to go through any of those things. They're just not going to do it, right? The great developers in San Francisco don't apply to jobs. They get recruited from everywhere, so they're not going to do any work to make a transaction happen. So you just need to be very careful about your onboarding flow and how you introduce people to the platform. So high quality, don't put any hoops in their way. Low quality, frankly, you can put some more tests and certifications in the way. Okay, so this is one thing I've definitely seen the best marketplaces do very well. And that's basically teaching your users. So every marketplace platform is different. There's kind of these community guidelines, and the whole community sort of forms a culture of their own. And obviously, places like Reddit, there's sort of this subculture and understanding of how you behave on these different platforms. The good platforms, you can really teach your users really by sharing a lot of past insight into the transactions. And there's one tactic that's actually particularly effective, which is I've definitely observed if you have a big platform and you put two new users together, so a new buyer and a new supplier, that transaction's going to fail. Like, it's just not going to work. But for every new buyer, if you can sort of guide them to work with a repeat supplier, someone that really knows how everything works, you're just going to have a much better chance of success. So that's probably my number one tactic to do, and it's a little like marketplace engineering, but it works incredibly well. And then, I'm still a big fan, and I'm actually surprised more people don't have these, but just simple community forums. It's the simplest thing, and it's wonderful, and the culture of the marketplace emerges on those forums, and frankly, it gives you fantastic product feedback too. So I'm a big fan of using more forums. All right. Okay, so now on to network effects. And obviously, everybody likes to talk about network effects. Everybody thinks that's great. It's winner take all. Every new user, this is sort of the way to think about perfect network effects. As market penetration increases, as you get to 100%, it's just this straight line. It gets better and better and better and better. I think the reality is that it tapers off. And just I think there's just a critical mass, right? And network effects can move quality or cost or turnaround time. But I think this is a great example of Uber here. So costs declined a little bit as they got market penetration just with the black cars. But then they really needed to reinvent the product to continue lowering the cost. There's just a limit to how low you could go because there's wages and cars and gas and things like that. And so that's why you have to introduce UberX to lower the asset value of the cars. And then, of course, you move to Uber Pool, so you have to group users together. You just can't do it with the same service. Those all taper off individually. And so you need to keep introducing new services and new approaches to these things to keep the quality or the cost improving. So I think, everybody talks about it. The reality is usually it tapers off really fast, especially with some of, you could think of, like a design marketplace. I'd say once you have about 100 designers, you're probably good. You don't need tens of thousands. 100 is actually just as good. Okay, so this is another lesson I've learned at a number of different places. Rev is probably the best example of this, and it's tiering your user base. So, I first had the assumption when I first got into this is like, hey, the marketplace will sort itself out. Let's just put everybody in the pool. We'll have feedback systems, and quality will rise to the top. They'll all be super happy, and the low quality will all get automatically filtered out. It's not quite that perfect. It doesn't really work that way, and retention of your best users is incredibly important. And so what we do at Rev is we have different tiers. So when everybody starts out, you're in kind of the base tier. But then as you prove yourself, as you do repeat transactions and get consistently high quality and always deliver on time, that's when we introduce a new tier. And you can give away different things to different tiers, but one of the things we do is we just say, all right, you get premium access to jobs. So when a job comes in, the premium tier has an hour before everybody else to claim that job. And that's a huge value add for these people because it keeps them incredibly busy, right? We want all of our best people working as much as they can. And so giving them that premium access in their, it's the Rever Plus tier, works incredibly well to keep them motivated and keep them cranking along. Okay, so build tiers. And then there's disintermediation. So this is my next, sort of the bane of every marketplace if you start losing your best customers. And actually one of those things on the checklist that I look for is I think there's a lot of different platforms where as people expand their usage, eventually they outgrow your marketplace and decide it's not providing enough value. That's like the death sentence, right? That kills your whole thing. And it's a pretty simple framework. As time goes on, many times the perceived value from your users declines. And part of that is because the part of the value that's the matching is all front-loaded. And then over time, you can do things like management tools and payment tools, but those tend to decline over time, and it's a much smaller value than that initial upfront match. And so the reality is, if you're charging a flat fee, at some point those lines cross and the users start to disintermediate. So you really only have two choices. You can either increase your value or lower your price. And so a lot of people are starting to experiment with pricing for long-term engagements, right? It might start at 20% and then it drops to 10% over time. I think that's a huge tactic to increase retention. The other one, the way to really increase value here is increase productivity. And that's the ultimate weapon. If you can truly increase the productivity of the work that is happening, then you'll always keep them on your platform, and hopefully you can charge as much as you want. And that's the way you can raise your rake as well. Okay, that's my disintermediation chart. So this is one of my favorites. I think this is one of the biggest lessons I've learned over time, is you really need to build virtuous cycles into your marketplace to constantly be improving quality. And when I think about my quality framework, it starts at you have to attract good people, and then you screen, and then you optimize so that your best people are getting the most work, and then of course retain your best users and expel your worst users. I think what happens is, by some human nature, we all think that we can screen incredibly well. It's like, no problem, we'll do certification testing, we curated, we interviewed, and I think we just kind of suck at that. You know, we've all probably hired lots of people and we've all made lots of mistakes, I'm sure. And so I think people tend to spend way too much time on the screening component, and they actually neglect the much more powerful things that are to the right. So optimizing, retaining, and expelling. And to me, that is by far the easiest thing to do, and it's way more accurate. And so this is where it gets into closing the loop on the transaction, really understanding who did a great job, who did a poor job, and then very quickly, you know, using tiers to optimize who gets work, and then basically doing everything you can to retain your best users, but being very aggressive about kicking out your worst users. And it's hard to do sometimes, but it's absolutely the best thing for the marketplace because they just create all this noise and create a vicious cycle on quality. Last one tiny point on this, you can actually get very delusional about quality because feedback systems in general are sort of like 5-star centered, and it's just nice, right? Like, you don't want to be a jerk, so you just rate everybody 5 stars. So it's easy to get very delusional about your quality, and I think you need different ways to measure it. Do anonymous feedback, way better. Okay, liquidity hacking. So by the way, pop quiz. Does anyone know which came first, the chicken or the egg? Who votes chicken? Who votes egg? All right, the eggs have it. So assuming you believe in evolution, mutations have to happen, and it happens in the embryonic stage. So there's an animal that wasn't quite a chicken that laid the first egg that became a chicken. So egg came first. Okay, so here's liquidity hacking. There's a lot of different ways to do this. I think a bunch of great different examples. This actually made this slide like 7 years ago, so a lot of these companies haven't done that well. But you can find aggregators and a lot of B2B ones. Office campuses are great. Some people just get an enterprise client that has millions of jobs to do across the world. A lot of people are still scraping Craigslist and just using that to seed, especially job marketplace type things. Providing value to one side, you know, this is sort of build the tool first and then build the marketplace later. And then just a quick story on OfferUp, which has been a wildly successful marketplace that I've been involved in. The key to their liquidity hacking was really simply focus. And it was down to literally a zip code level focus, which Facebook marketing allows you to do, and focus on a single category. You know, it's a horizontal platform, but we started with just a single category, a single demographic, a single age range, and in a very high frequency use case. So narrowing that focus, you know, in the early stages, it's so hard to get to do everything. And all the companies I've seen that are like, you know, we're a marketplace for everything, those all fail right out of the gate. And then what we did at Odesk, which is now Upwork, was really just kind of brute force. We acted much more like recruiters in the early stage, and we were picking up the phone, and then I was, you know, talking to a client on the phone, and then chatting with developers in Russia and trying to make matches happen in real time. So sometimes you can just do it brute force, and then you automate later. I think I'm running low on time. So this is what I think of as the fraud curve, and you know, every marketplace is going to have fraud. As soon as you reach any kind of scale, you're going to attract all sorts of different bad behavior. It starts off at nothing. That's great. That's like the glory days. And then People start paying attention to your marketplace and you get like ripped to shreds. People take advantage of you. You're going to lose tons of money. You're going to have chargebacks. You're going to have all these problems. And then what actually happens is an overcorrection. So the natural reaction to that is, all right, let's clamp down. We need to require certification and ID and credit card and bank statements. And then it's very easy to overcorrect. And actually, because fraud and growth tend to compete, your growth hacker guys are like, just open it up. And the fraud guys want to put in all these gates. The reality is, you're never going to end at zero. And I would argue if you're at zero fraud, you're too restrictive. So you actually need to open things up a little bit. And it's a delicate balancing act, but that's what I've observed in most good marketplaces. There's always fraud. Okay, and then this is my last one, and then questions. You actually just heard from Masterclass, so it ties in very well here. I think there's an emerging class of marketplaces that are just simply master marketplaces. And most that we've seen so far have been these commodities. And in the commodities, people are really paying for the cost savings and the convenience and things like that. And then for these master marketplaces that are a unique case, people are really paying for access, I think, more than anything else. It's no longer about the cost savings. But then what's very key is the suppliers are very, very different. For most cases, it's not so much about the money anymore in the master marketplace. It's much more about the prestige and the brand and the reputation that you're doing. And then for the commodity, of course, they do value most of the earnings, the convenience, and actually just like time to payment is one of the single biggest values. If you can pay earlier, that's always going to get you incredible loyalty from your suppliers. The other thing is I actually don't think these can mix. I don't think you can have a commodity marketplace that layers master on top of it and vice versa. It kills it. So the groups just, it's oil and water. They don't mix at all. So I'm out of time. That's it. That's my collection of observations for the last 13 years. So open it up to questions, or we can all go to lunch. So whatever you want.
Any other questions?
Josh, give us a good idea for a B2B horizontal marketplace.
B2B horizontal marketplace. Well, I think like Ariba was kind of the first of this wave way back when, 20 years ago. I actually haven't, the ones I've seen are kind of a combination. So it's vertical within an industry, but then horizontal across all suppliers. So RigUp, the oil and gas one, there might be 3,000 different vendors in 100 different categories that one of these companies might use. So it's the whole industry, but it's builders and developers and certification guys and inspectors and everything that you could possibly want in that platform. But I haven't really seen a complete horizontal one. Yeah.
So you talked about disintermediation.
Yep.
And how many companies are changing their price levels as time continues on. Are there other ways to do that without changing your price levels, like maybe liability protection that you wouldn't get outside of the platform?
Yeah. I would say sort of. I think most people don't value those very highly, especially if you're starting to work with the same person over and over again. It's just like you've already established trust, so you don't feel like you need the marketplace as much anymore. But it's hard.
So for someone like that, would you say do the price decreases over time?
Yeah,
like
probably. Yeah, look, I think if you can measure disintermediation. It's tricky because they don't tell you about it, but you can get a reasonably good estimate. And if you think it's a problem, like I said, you only have two choices. So if you don't have any brilliant ways to add more value, then you have no choice. You have to lower fees. Yeah.
So you mentioned, I think in one of your slides, that a way to attract folks to your platform was to provide them some advantage if they're kind of some better echelon, if you will, a better tier, right? How do you balance that with the fact that the platform then itself becomes less fair to the entirety of the population using the platform, right? So some people may feel that they're at a disadvantage now because of that.
Sure. I think you can get away with it if you're completely transparent with how to get in and out of the top tiers, right? If it's just stated from day one and it's completely objective, it's not like I like you and not you. It's if you meet this quality bar and this turnaround time and this total earnings, you reach the next tier. And as long as it's transparent and you're not constantly changing it around, I think users respect that. Bye.